this is how, just to everyone, this is how it will work tonight. So basically, Andy's going to share a presentation of around 25 minutes, and then we can all ask questions. And how we do that is through the chat. So in the chat, you can pop your question in, and I'll be picking up some of those questions and asking them to Andy for another like 20 minutes. So do ask any questions while he's speaking. At any point, just ask questions, and I'll then pick them up and ask him the questions. And at the end of everything, what we're going to do is do a little poll. So I'll choose 3 of the questions that I think are the best, and then you all vote, and whichever question gets the most votes wins a book, and we'll send the book directly to your home. So that's a plan. So remember, if you've got any questions, go into the chat, just ask them, and then I'll pick them up and ask them to Andy after his presentation. So I think we're ready for your presentation now, Andy. So whenever you're ready, just go for it, and I'll remove myself from the spotlight.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that that introduction, Nico, and hopefully you can see my slides, and my sort of ugly mug is now slightly smaller and on the screen. And so, yeah, tonight's topic, I want to talk to you for sort of 25 minutes or so about you know, this classic big question, really: has science buried God? And to kind of set the scene for where I want to go this evening, one of the most famous scientists who ever lived was the gentleman on the slide next to me on the screen. That's, of course, Albert Einstein. Brilliant scientific mind, and also possessor of one of the most impressive haircuts in the history of science. And there are lots of stories told about Einstein, both about his brilliance, but also about his eccentricity. In fact, one of my favorite Einstein stories concerns the time, I think it was in the 1920s, 1930s, just after he'd come out with his general theory of relativity that made him famous. He was doing a big lecture tour all across the USA, speaking at dozens and dozens of universities about his new theory of relativity. And it was coming to the end of this tour, and he was tired, and he quite frankly didn't want to give the lecture for the sort of 100th time. And as they were approaching the final university on this epic speaking tour, Einstein sort of said to his driver, his chauffeur, you know, how bored he was. And in fact, he said to his chauffeur, you know, you've probably heard this talk yourself so many times, it bores you. In fact, I bet you could give the talk as well as I could. And his Jimmy, his chauffeur, said, oh, I think I probably could, sir. And as they drove on, actually the two of them, who got on quite well, they'd spent, you know, months together doing this lecture tour, they hatched this little plan. They hatched this plan that when they got to the university, Jimmy, the driver, and Einstein would change clothes. And Jimmy, with the chauffeur, would put on Einstein's kind of suit, and Einstein would dress up as the chauffeur, and they would see whether they could actually pull off the switch, whether Jimmy, the chauffeur, could actually do the talk that he'd heard 100 times better than Einstein. This was the days before sort of social media, when you could easily look up people's photos and things. And so they arrived at the university in the car park. They changed costume and walked on into the campus. And of course, the chauffeur was greeted with all the pomp and circumstance that you'd expect a famous scientist to receive. And Einstein shuffled along behind, the chauffeur's cap pulled down over his head, hoping nobody would recognize him. Now, lo and behold, when the lecture began, it turned out, in fact, Jimmy, the chauffeur, had indeed got the talk pretty much pat. He memorized it, and he gave it better than Einstein. He sparkled, he glittered, he did an amazing presentation of Einstein's work. And all went well until it came to the time of Q&A after the talk. And the first person to the microphone after the lecture was a professor of physics at this university who hated Einstein and everything he stood for. And he had spent weeks preparing the toughest, the hardest question on physics and relativity that anyone could possibly come up with. And he leapt up, he got to the microphone, and he asked this question. There was stunned silence in the auditorium. And the chauffeur, dressed as Einstein, looked down at him from the stage and said, "Sir, that is the single most stupid question I've ever heard. In fact, it is so stupid and so simple that my chauffeur, sitting at the back of the lecture theatre, could answer it, and I'm going to invite him here onto the podium to do so." History does not record what happened after that little episode, but if it's true and not apocryphal, I think it gives an insight into, as I say, Einstein was quite a character. And Einstein, as well as views on physics and science, also thought a lot about religion. And on one occasion, he said these very famous words. Einstein said, he said, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. Now, those are very generous words. He doesn't think that, science has buried God. Far from it. He thought the two fitted together in numerous ways. But I meet many people today who think that Einstein was wrong and that religion and science, far from being complementary, are in fact at war with each other. For example, another very famous physicist, the late physicist Stephen Hawking, very famous professor of physics, Cambridge University, famous also for being kind of wheelchair bound, but producing incredible work despite his disability. Stephen Hawking once said these words. He said, "Philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." And he goes on in that longer piece from which that's drawn to say that, philosophy, theology, religion, they are all irrelevant because science and science alone can uncover truth and take us forward. Now, that's quite a statement by Hawking, and if we had time, we could quote others like it. And I can partly understand why for some people in our culture, for many people in our culture perhaps, science has been elevated almost to kind of quasi-religious status. It has become the supreme tool, the supreme way we get knowledge by which we judge everything else. I can understand why. I mean, science is pretty impressive. Science has gadgets and graphs and technology and so many things. It looks very impressive. And of course, our political leaders are in awe of science. In fact, we have seen this, I think, consistently during the COVID pandemic, when our political leaders have endlessly spoken about following the science, even when the decisions they're making are more political and economic ones. In fact, here, in Scotland, where I live, last year when the vaccine program was launched, Nicola Sturgeon came right out and she said of the Pfizer vaccine, she said, "Science has saved us." Almost religious language. Science has saved us. And this elevation of science above everything else in our culture has, I think, fueled this belief that you sometimes hear that we don't need God anymore. God has been done away with. Science has buried God. It is science, not God, that will lead us to utopia. Now, speaking of utopia, this kind of beautiful, amazing future that many of us dream of, utopia has been a human dream for generations. The idea that we can get to this wonderful, glorious future where everything is amazing and beautiful and wonderful and peaceful and so on and so forth. Utopia is the theme of so many stories and so many stories and so much art and movies and many more things. And the fact that we're always dreaming of utopia doesn't actually entirely surprise me, because there are two basic questions that every human being has to answer, no matter what they believe. And I think the person who's possibly started screen sharing might want to stop that, because it's going to mess up the slides. So thank you very much. Brilliant. There are two basic questions that everybody has to answer in life. On this call this evening, whether you're a person of faith or you have no faith, there are two pretty basic questions that every human being has to grapple with. The first is this one: what's wrong with the world? It's pretty obvious that the world is not perfect. There are things wrong with it. What's gone wrong with the world? And then the other question that all of us need to think about, no matter our religious beliefs, is the question, what's the solution? And we live in a culture that's very tempted to tell us that the solutions to the problems of the world can all be found through science and technology. Now, let me give you an example of that kind of approach to life. Listen to these words of one scientist, one very famous scientist, dreaming about what this great utopian future might look like and how science can get us there. This scientist says, we will soon have everything. We will soon have everywhere: smoke annihilators, dust absorbers, ozonizers, sterilizers of water, air, food, and clothing, and accident preventers on streets, elevated roads, and in subways. It will be next to impossible to contract disease, germs, or to get hurt in the city. Humanity will become united, wars made impossible, and peace will reign supreme. Now, what famous scientist said those words? Well, interestingly, those words were uttered by Nikola Tesla, very famous scientist indeed, in 1915. And they look somewhat quaint and naive from the perspective of 100 years after he wrote them. Yet despite our tendency to get carried away sometimes when we think about science, I still, I want to be very clear that I'm not anti-science. I think science is a wonderful thing. I love science. My academic background lies in science. I'll give you a brief kind of taste of what I did during that little interview Nico did with me. But that PhD that I described was partly in computer science. That work I did on early Islamic manuscripts was developing computational linguistic models and writing software for studying and analyzing ancient texts. And computer science has been a passion of my life for 30 years or so. And I happen to think that science more broadly is one of the best things that human beings have ever invented. But what is often missed is that science, and in particular the scientific method, is actually thoroughly Christian in its roots. In fact, as historians of science have regularly remarked, it is no accident that science, and by science I mean an organized, systematic discipline funded by the state, science has only arisen once in human history, and it arose in medieval Christian Europe. And historians have probed into why that is. And when you start exploring that historical origin to science, it turns out it was in fact no accident. And there's a very well-known historian of science called James Hannam. There's one of his more popular books, God's Philosophers. James is from Cambridge University. And let me give you a little taste of what he says in that book about the origins of science and how it's so linked to Christianity. He writes, the starting point for all science in the Middle Ages was that nature had been created by God. And that made it a legitimate area of study because through science, man could learn about its creator. Medieval scholars thought that nature followed the rules that God had ordained. And because God was consistent, those natural laws were constant and were therefore worth scrutinizing. And the only way to find out the laws that God had decided on was by the use of experience and observation and so on and so forth. So science has these very, very Christian roots. But what I find fascinating, though, despite its roots and despite its usefulness and its wonder and so on, just for all of its usefulness, there are some limits to science. And one limit to science is that science can't actually tell us what a perfect world, or actually even what a better world would look like. If we're thinking about how we solve the problems of the world, science can't actually tell us what a better world would look like. The problem, you see, is phrases like perfect world and better world, they describe destinations we want to aim at. And science can't actually tell you what you should be aiming at. If you decide what you're aiming at, it can certainly help you get there, but it can't actually tell you, kind of once you can't actually tell you where you should be going in the first place. By way of analogy, I'm a mountain climber. I mentioned that in the interview I did with Nico. And I love bagging Munros. Those are the Scottish hills over 3,000 feet. And whenever I go walking, I take a map and I take a compass, good scientific tools, actually. And should I decide to climb Schiehallion, that's a beautiful kind of pyramid-shaped mountain, about 45 minutes drive from where I live, my map, my compass will help me get to the summit of that mountain. But my map and my compass can't choose the destination for me. The question, which mountain should I climb on my day off, is actually not a scientific question, nor are questions like, where should we be aiming as a society? What does a better world look like? You see, for all of its power and effectiveness, for all of its brilliance, for all of its beauty and wonder, it's crucially important that we remember there are only so many things that science can do. And there are some incredibly important areas of knowledge where science can do nothing at all. But let me give you another example of perhaps the limits of science. Consider the photo on the screen here. This is of course, the Mona Lisa, one of the world's most famous paintings, painted by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, suppose we want to ask the question, why did Leonardo da Vinci paint Lisa del Giocondo with this enigmatic smile? Well, it's a very strange facial expression she's wearing in that picture, right? I mean, is she bemused? Is she upset? Is she constipated? I mean, what exactly is going on with that sort of flat-faced sort of smile she's got going on there? Well, suppose we want to answer the question, why did he paint her that way? Well, we could do all manner of scientific experiments, couldn't we? We could do a chemical analysis of the paint and find the chemical constituents of the paint that Leonardo used. We could take some of the wood paneling on which the a Mona Lisa is painted. And using a scientific method called dendrochronology, we could date to within sort of 10 to 20 years when the tree was cut down, from which the wood panels were built to make the panel for that picture. But none of those scientific experiments, and there are probably many more we might dream up, not a single one of them would answer for you the question, why did Leonardo da Vinci paint Lisa del Giocondo's portrait with that particular facial expression? For that, we need a totally different area of knowledge. We need art history. And in fact, as the Nobel Prize winning scientist, Peter Medawar, put it in a very famous book a few years ago called The Limits of Science. He was not a religious man, he was an atheist as far as I'm aware, but Peter was well aware that there is a whole range of things science can't do. He writes that there is a limit to science. It is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. I have in mind questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? In fact, a question I would add to Peter's list there would be a hugely important question in our culture today, a question that divides us, and a huge amount of time spent debating this question, and that's the question, what is the value of a human life? You know, we are very, very concerned about human rights and justice and dignity as a society. And human rights, in fact, is based on the assumption that human beings have value and dignity and worth. But science can't help us here. Science cannot tell us the value of a life. Science can tell us how to extend a life. It can tell us how to save a life. It can tell us how to abort one or destroy one, but it can't tell us the value of one. And this, my friends, is simply because science is morally neutral. Science is morally neutral. And this comes out in all kinds of fields in science, actually, including some very cutting edge ones, where the moral neutrality of science is a massive problem. For example, one of the big growth areas in my own discipline in computer science right now is artificial intelligence. You've probably heard lots about artificial intelligence. Maybe you have Siri on your iPhone or Alexa, you know, sitting on the working top in the kitchen at home, and you know, some fairly basic artificial intelligence software is driving those products. But as artificial intelligence gets more and more sophisticated, one of the huge problems that scientists are faced with is how do we build values and morality into artificial intelligence systems. In fact, one of the academics thinking the most about this right now is Nick Bostrom at Oxford University, and there's his book on the screen for you. And he put it nicely in an interview recently. So the biggest challenge for us is how do we decide what do we want the super intelligence, the AI, to want? Get that wrong, and you potentially create a shiny new artificial intelligence that decides that human beings are expendable in the pursuit of its goals. It's a pretty massive question to get right, and science right now doesn't really have the answer to that question. Or consider a historical example of the moral neutrality of science. The gentleman on the screen here, one of those famous chemists of the 20th century, his name, Louis Frederick Pfizer. He was instrumental in developing the first artificial synthesis of vitamin K necessary for blood coagulation. And that discovery has saved possibly tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives saved by his work. But he also invented something else. As well as saving hundreds of thousands of lives through vitamin K synthesis, he invented something else. In 1942, the US Army asked Pfizer and his team at Harvard University to help develop for them a chemical weapon that could burn vast tracts of jungle and eliminate troops. And Pfizer and his team went on to invent something called napalm, a gel that sticks to human flesh as it burns. And on the 9th of March, 1945, 1,700 tons of napalm were dropped on Tokyo, burning 100,000 civilians to death. Now, maybe you can justify that in the wider context of the Second World War. But when you see how napalm was used in Vietnam, things get considerably tougher. And see, Pfizer's story is a salutary reminder that science can harm as well as hurt. And it's also a salutary reminder that science doesn't shut down religious questions or moral questions. Rather, science creates those questions. You know, the more powerful we become through tools like science, the more danger we find ourselves in as human beings, and the bigger the questions become. Human beings are, if we are honest with ourselves, a moral mess. And science is often part of the problem, not part of the solution. Which reminds me of one final issue with science that I want to use to kind of draw the threads together and open up one final thought for us this evening before we open up this for Q&A. In most cases, I think science is really good at addressing symptoms, but it often can't address the root causes of the major problems facing our world. And let me illustrate what I mean by taking one of the greatest challenges of our age as an example, the environmental challenges our planet is currently facing. Now, we hear a lot these days about climate change, and that's rightly talked about a lot, but there are actually lots of other environmental challenges right now. For example, there's loss of biodiversity and growing extinction rates. We have deforestation. We're facing issues of sea level rise and then massive pollution problems, especially plastic in the oceans. And you don't need to be an eco warrior and spray paint yourself green to see we have something of a problem. So what is the solution to all these environmental issues that we hear so much about these days? Well, it's very easy to assume the answer is to reduce carbon emissions, to ban plastic packaging, to send Greta Thunberg on yet another world tour. But what if something much more profound is needed? One of the leading climate experts in our world today is the gentleman on the screen here. His name is Gus Speth. He was for many years under the Obama administration in the US, one of the US's government's leading advisors on climate change, now works for the United Nations. Brilliant scientist and environmental campaigner who probably knows more about the environment than most people in the world today. Massive list of expertise and publications to Gus's name. As far as I know, he is not a religious person. He would probably call himself an agnostic. He's not he wouldn't call himself and say there is a God. He wouldn't say there isn't a God. He isn't really sure. But listen to his diagnosis of what's gone wrong with the world, because it's fascinating. Gus writes, he says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are greed, selfishness, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and a spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Fascinating reflection. Well, it strikes me that Christians who have actually, of course, been involved in the sciences since the very beginning and right down to the present day, that was a big survey done just over 5 years ago, looking at Christian faith, looking at religious faith in the sciences. Big study from Rice University in the States looked at 10,000 scientists, 70% of whom had a PhD or higher. And it's fascinating to find of those 10,000 scientists, at least 75% thought there was some kind of God. Only a 20 or 24% actually thought there was any conflict between science and religion. And 40% of those 10,000 of the world's most brilliant men and women in the sciences were very happy to affirm the statement, I am religious. Well, Christians working in the sciences have long realized that although science is great, we need something more than science and technology. After all, Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, said these words recorded for us in the Gospels, in the New Testament, in the Bible. He said, what good is it for a person to gain the whole world, yet to forfeit his soul? Or what can a person give in exchange for their soul? In other words, I think what Jesus is touching on here is the idea that we can gain all kinds of power as human beings. We can gain power over nature. We can manipulate atoms. We can send, digital messages around the world ever faster. But if in the process we lose our very self, what have we gained? I said right at the start, the two most important questions that we can ask are what's gone wrong with the world and what's the solution? And the thought I want to leave you with is, what if the solution to the greatest challenges facing us requires more than just science? You see, the Bible tells us that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. We have the ability, the tendency, the temptation as human beings to use science for great good, but also for great evil. And the problem that lies behind that is our relationship with the God who created us has been fractured and damaged. But I believe that God created us with a desire for us to be in a relationship with him, but too often we've actually wanted to be God in God's place, to seize power for ourselves, and we've damaged our world in the process. And the whole of human history actually affirms that biblical story very powerfully. But what if that is not the end of the story? Because the exciting news at the heart of the Christian faith is that actually there is a hope and there is a future, but it's not to be found by clever science or smart technology or brilliant AI, wonderful as those things may be in their place. Now, I want to leave you with a thought as we move into Q&A. And it centers around this, really, that a couple of years ago was the 50th anniversary of one of the greatest scientific projects ever undertaken, celebrating the moment when, on the 24th of July, 1969, human beings first walked on the moon, the result of years of science and technology and engineering. Well, interestingly, when Neil Armstrong, there in that picture, first human being to walk on the moon, when he first saw the Earth from space on the previous mission to the one where he walked on the moon, he was deeply humbled. And he said these words. He said, as he looked out of the window of his Apollo spacecraft and saw that little blue dot in the distance, he said, it suddenly struck me that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and I shut one eye and my thumb blotted out planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant though. I felt very, very small. Yet the wonderful news is, the Bible says that tiny blue pea, covered with even smaller human beings, people with the capacity to reach the stars, but also capable of destroying others, are actually very precious to God's eyes. And that God himself actually, in Jesus Christ, stepped onto that tiny blue pea so that we have the possibility of knowing not just science, but of knowing the designer and of discovering what life is for and where we should be heading, not just how to use the compass. You see, we need answers to the questions, not just of how do we do stuff, but we also need answers about why we're here in the first place and what we're here for. Questions that science was never designed to answer, but questions that Christianity, from which science sprang, have something to say. In particular, they have something to say centered around the person of Jesus, who said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. Well, thank you for listening so patiently. Let me hand back over to Nico, who will talk us through how the Q&A is going to work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Thanks for sharing all of that. We've got a few questions coming up, but if anyone has any questions, please do pop them into the chat and I'll see how we can fit them in the next few minutes. So just put them there, either send it to me alone or to everyone, and then we'll see if we can ask them. But the first question that came through, which I found really interesting, was for scientists, it's important, the whole peer review thing, where kind of you write a document, someone kind of questions it. How does Christianity and the Bible hold in that kind of peer review against, obviously not believers, the kind of scientists that aren't believers? Does it create a bit of doubt? Do they just say, oh, all of this is rubbish? Have you read a bit about this kind of peer review idea?
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant question. One of the things that's fascinating, Nika, thank you too for whoever asked that question, is there's been a lot of research done around the origins of science. I quoted you James Hannam earlier, but I forget, there was another historian of science I was reading a couple of years ago who actually did some work on the origins of peer review. And the origins of peer review are actually deeply Christian. Because one of the things the Bible teaches about human beings is that we are precious and valuable because we are made in God's image. The Bible is very clear about that. The Bible is also very clear that we are messed up, broken, and untrustworthy. The word the Bible uses about that is sin. That actually we are also people whose nature are corrupted, which is why we need the work of Jesus to save us and rescue us and restore us. And built into the idea of peer review is peer review is actually based on the idea that you can't trust your fellow scientist. You say, if we could all trust each other, it would be easy. I wouldn't need to double check my colleagues' results because they'd be trustworthy. But actually, we can't trust one another. It might turn out my colleague has got a lot of money riding on, proving a particular set of results for a drug company. And so peer review is based on this deeply Christian assumption that we're untrustworthy. And that's where it originates. It actually originates in that idea. So I love the fact that, again, one of those pillars of science is deeply Christian. In terms of the Christian faith itself, and I suppose peer review, one of the things I find fascinating is with my kind of historian's hat on for a moment, is when we come to the for me, the most important part of the Bible, all of the Bible is important to me as a Christian, but perhaps the most precious part would be the 4 biographies of Jesus, the Gospels in the New Testament, from which we get to read about the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's just so exciting to me as someone who's passionate about history as well as the sciences, that in a sense you have peer review, because those Gospels interact with each other. There is overlap, yes, but independence as well. We have extra biblical sources, material outside the Bible that in places affirms what's inside it. We also have archaeology. I've got a very good friend of mine that works down in the south coast of England, who is a eminent archaeologist, and he could talk to you for hours about the way that the archaeology doesn't entirely prove the story of the Gospels, but supports it and underpins it and corroborates it. Where events and people and names and dates mentioned in the Gospels turn up in archaeology and so on. So I suppose that would be the equivalent of peer review, because remember, with the Bible, we were dealing largely with a historical claim, not a scientific claim. But yeah, we have the equivalent to peer review in the sciences and in history, where we can show that things corroborate one another, and we definitely have that for the Bible, for the Gospels, and for the life of Jesus.
Another question here is someone's saying that Brian Cox promotes an idea that eventually science will explain everything, and it's just a matter of time before science will just be able to explain everything. How would you respond to that?
Well, the ironic thing is, you could argue that the claim, I think, that science will explain everything is itself not a scientific claim. So the first thing you could say to Brian is, it's an interesting philosophical position. Why do you think it? And I'd love to know what scientific experiment he would possibly do that could convince us of that. So even by the way he's made that statement, he's actually stepped outside science. Second thing I would say, based upon that, is I think that idea is not a new idea. See, someone like Brian Cox comes out and says it on a TV documentary today, and people think, oh, what an amazing idea! This is very new, and of course, very 21st century. That idea has been around for centuries, because really ever since the sciences got going, people who are very keen on the sciences got a little bit carried away, and that really reached its zenith in the 1960s with a movement, with an intellectual movement called logical positivism, which tried to advance the idea that not merely can science explain everything, but that actually really only scientific claims have any truth value. That anything that can't be tested scientifically is actually meaningless, and that collapsed badly. Eventually, partly when people pointed out the statement "only scientific claims have truth value" is not in itself a scientific statement. And my challenge to someone like Brian would be, tell me where you've got the idea that there are not vast amounts of questions out there that science can't answer. And one of them we addressed this evening, the question of, where should we be heading as society? What does a better future look like? What does a good life look like? What does a life well lived look like? Once you've answered those questions, absolutely, science can help us get there. It's a brilliant tool. But actually, the biggest questions in life, I think, are political, economic, cultural, and profoundly religious. Because the question, what do you think we are here for as human beings? Are we just a random collection of atoms thrown together by accident? Or are we people with real value and dignity because we're made in God's image? Your answer to that question shapes everything.
So that brings him back to one of the first questions I had. And the question is, can science tell us anything about our purpose as humanity? Can it give us any indication at all about any sense of purpose for humankind?
The simple answer is no. I'll unpack that slightly, but absolutely no. Science can't tell us anything about purpose, simply because it's not the right kind of tool for doing that. And actually, it's interesting that we obviously there are a lot of scientists who do have religious faith. There are also those who don't. It's really interesting actually how bleak some of the answers are, to the question, what are we here for, from scientists who are atheists. I actually respect some of the willingness for some of them to be outrightly bleak. So for example, someone like Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the shape of the DNA molecule, for which he won the Nobel Prize, he on one occasion said, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. You're nothing more than, chemicals and electrical sparks fizzing in your brain. In one sense, there isn't a you to speak of. Richard Dawkins, very famous atheist, Oxford biologist, Richard said, we are just dancing to our selfish genes. Our genes are pulling our strings, as it were, to make us behave a certain way. We have and from that it would follow we have no freedom, no value, no dignity, none of these things. So yeah, I don't think science can answer that purpose question in the slightest. For that we need something much, much bigger. But purpose is crucial, right, Nico? Because without purpose, there are so many things that we can't determine. And one of the biggest ones, of course, is back to this question of what does a life well lived or a life badly lived look like? If I were to say to you, I'm a bit grumpy actually this evening. I know I'm coming across very positively, but actually I'm feeling a bit cross this evening. And you'd say, well, why is that, Andy? And I would say, well, I bought this watch, the other week, and actually it's a bad watch. The jewellery store ripped me off. You say, oh, why? In what ways is it a bad watch? And I said, well, last night I was hammering in nails with my watch. I was putting shelves up and I was using this thing as a hammer and I broke it and it's a bad watch. I'd like to think he would take me quietly aside and say, Andy, that's actually not the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is to tell the time. And we determine whether it's a good watch or a bad watch by how effectively it does that. And you would be right. Well, the same with a human life. How can we talk about what a good life or a bad life looks like unless we know the purpose of a human life? And the only way to get that is if we can hear, as it were, from the designer itself, which is, of course, again, what's so exciting about the Christian faith, because there's so much that Jesus had to say about what human life is really all about.
Another question, which is more kind of scientific, kind of physics maybe. So Gabe's asking, did God create the energy compacted matter before the Big Bang? So did he produce the Big Bang or whatever came to make it happen?
Well, I'm so glad someone brought up the Big Bang, because here things get very interesting. There's a connection to Einstein, with whom we started at the beginning. But we forget, because we live in a world where most of us have grown up with the Big Bang all over the place. In the background, as it were, everybody takes it for granted. But really, until the beginning of the 20th century, the standard view among scientists was the universe had always been here. It was eternal. It existed forever, and it always would exist. And then along comes Einstein with his brand new theories of relativity, and he ran the numbers and ran the maths, and the equations he'd come up with predicted the universe was expanding. If the universe was expanding, there must have been a time when it began. Now he knew that couldn't, he knew in his head that couldn't be right, because everybody knew it had always been here. So he literally fudged the numbers. He introduced something called the cosmological constant into his equations to give him an eternal universe. He later said this was the biggest blunder of his scientific career. Well, roll forward through the 20th century, and there were a couple of big discoveries which actually gave us, actual physical evidence that the universe was expanding. Most famously in the 1960s, when two telephone engineers working for Bell Laboratories in the States were messing around with early radio telescopes, and they heard, wherever they pointed their radio telescope in the night sky, they heard the same echo, radiation echo coming back at them. And they basically discovered the echo of the Big Bang, and they had now physical evidence for what Einstein had predicted. And interestingly, many scientists hated this idea. And there was an atheist cosmologist, British cosmologist called Sir Fred Hoyle, who actually coined the term, I think it was the 1950s, coined the term Big Bang as an insult. He referred to this ridiculous Big Bang idea, because he hated the idea the universe had a beginning, because Fred realized that opened up theological questions. Because if the universe began in a Big Bang, then a Big Bang, part of the sort of the metaphor, a Big Bang requires a big banger. It requires someone to light the blue touch paper. And I actually think the Big Bang is this amazingly powerful piece of evidence for creation, because something has to stand outside space and time. If the Big Bang is the thing that brought space and time and matter into existence, we need something that is outside of space, outside of time, and outside of matter as the cause of that. And if that doesn't look very much like God, I don't know what does.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question which someone's asking, so essentially aren't science and Christianity basically answering different questions? One is the objective world, and which is science, and Christian faith looks at subjective questions, things that are less objective scientifically.
Yeah. Brilliant question, whoever answered that. I want to say a sort of yes and no. I would absolutely say that there is science and Christianity are answering a different type of question. but there is some overlap. And I would also say both are objective. And by objective, we mean truth that is outside of us. So a subjective truth claim might be something like, I prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate. But then, of course, Nico, you might say, I prefer raspberry ripple, because that's our own subjective preference. Science, on the other hand, is dealing with stuff, with matter and with atoms and so forth. But with Christianity, we're dealing with objective truth too. God either does or doesn't exist. My personal preference has nothing to do with it. Jesus either did or did not, walk the dusty streets of Palestine in the 1st century AD. He either was or was not nailed to a cross by the Romans. He either did or did not rise bodily from the dead 3 days later. Those are objective claims as well. But they are not directly overlapping. Now, what's important for us to understand here, of course, is that there can be different levels of explanation. And this is helpful to get our head around, because science deals with a certain level of explanation. Let me illustrate what I mean. If I walked into my kitchen after I've come off this call, and I asked, and the kettle is boiling in the corner of the kitchen, and I said, well, why is the water boiling in the kettle? And my 9-year-old, who's been busy studying these things and is full of excitement, pipes up and she goes, well, it's Brownian motion in the atoms. The atoms are bouncing off each other in the kettle, and that's what's causing the water to boil. Or my son, who is into science too, would go, no, Dad, it's because the electricity is turned on and that's flowing through the elements and exciting the atoms in the element, which are getting hot and transferring the heat to the water through thermodynamics, which would be a very impressive answer for a 6-year-old. Those are perfectly good scientific answers, and there's nothing wrong with them. But there's a higher level answer, isn't there, which is the reason the kettle is boiling is my wife wants to make herself a cup of tea because she's about to sit down and do the crossword. Now, those are not mutually exclusive. The scientific answer doesn't do away with the higher level answer, and nor does the higher level answer mean we can ignore the science. They fit together well. And that's a helpful way, I think, of thinking about Christian faith and science. They're not at war with each other. I have no time for atheists who want to, try and use science to throw God out the window. Equally, I have no time for Christians who want to say, well, we got God, so we can ignore science. The two things fit together beautifully, but it's important to use the right tool for the right question. If you try and use science to answer the question, what is God like? You're going to get badly wrong. If you try and open the Bible at random and try and get the formula for chlorine out of it, then you're going to go badly wrong.
So I want to try and fit in at least 2 more questions because there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here in the chat. I'm sorry I don't get to ask all the questions, but someone here asked a really interesting, interested to know your thoughts on whether the concepts of good and bad, belief as an emotion, are just evolutionary psychological tools, especially where different cultures have developed different religions. So is that something kind of an evolutionary aspect of humankind, or what's your thought on that?
That's a great question. Well, of course, the first thing I would say, in terms of, you mentioned both I think morality and religion there, but let's talk about religion for a moment. If of course it's the case that religion is merely an evolutionary response, of course that actually, and it was actually an atheist friend who first put me onto this, actually puts atheists into a really sticky position, because given the fact the majority of human beings throughout the whole of history and around the world today, atheism today as a percentage of human beings is declining. Atheists are going down as a number of the population if you look around at world religious trends. So humans have always been profoundly religious, looks like they always will be. In other words, human beings have been utterly deceived by our genes and our genetics and by evolution. We cannot trust our beliefs, and look at how badly wrong human beings have gone consistently. But of course, atheists are part of that great human family, which means if we can't trust our thinking here, we probably can't trust it anywhere. And actually, if you try and explain religion away purely as an evolutionary response, as an evolutionary thing, well, the same applies to everything else in culture, because everything has been produced by evolution, including science. And actually, the consistent position would sit on the ground, heap dust and ashes on our heads and go, we can't know anything because evolution has tricked us. On the other hand, I want to say, if we live in a universe in which there is a God and there is a spiritual realm, that human beings are not just matter, we are also spirit as well, it's hardly surprising that different human cultures around the world have responded to that differently. Doesn't surprise me at all that every human culture we know of has seen human beings reach out to try and connect with God. about the famous Christian thinker Augustine, one of the most famous philosophers in the first sort of 300 years of the Christian era, writing in the 300s, talks about the fact, he has a lovely phrase where he says, in the hearts of men. He's quoting that from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And he says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. In other words, deep down in us, we have this deep spiritual desire. And I've actually got a book on my shelf. I was trying to look for it when that question came in, but I've just reorganized my study and can't find it. There's a wonderful book called Wired for God, written by a Christian geneticist, talking about the fact that we do indeed seem to be wired into our DNA to ask these kind of spiritual questions. And far from that being an argument against God, I think it looks much more like an argument for, quite frankly.
Brilliant. Sorry, there's a lot. I'm just going to end up with two questions. I'm sorry, but there's a few really interesting ones, but it's nearly 9 already. But one of the questions here asks, what, like you as maybe a Christian thinker, what do you think of aspects of science that are going into kind of tricky territory like cloning and stuff like that? How does kind of where does kind of the advancements of science and your faith kind of how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, what a brilliant question. Again, thank you for whoever asked that. In one sense, we obviously touched on that a bit in the talk with that example I gave of Louis Pfizer. With really interesting when you look at his biography. Here's a man who saved hundreds, maybe even millions of lives now, but also killed hundreds of thousands of people. And just wherever you look, I think we have to be very, very careful to realize that, science gives us great power, and we can use that power for good, we can use that power for evil. And one of the mistakes we consistently make as human beings is to assume, well, because we can do something, we should do something. And I think that's why it is so crucial as a society, as we, science develops by leaps and bounds, that we create space where we can have these ethical conversations, where we can sit down, those of people of faith and people of no faith, and actually wrestle through some of these big questions and be willing to say, look, just because the science can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should do something. And history is replete, I think, with stories of what happens when we forget that lesson. And as a Christian, and for, I know this is a mixed audience, certainly I'd say for Christians on this call, I think that's something that Christians have something, very valuable to bring into these discussions in society, about reminding us that central biblical teaching that actually underpins modern human rights theory, that human beings are not just atoms and particles, but bear the image of God, a God who created us, made us, loves us, and demonstrates that for what he did in the person of Jesus. And whenever we lose sight of that, and we begin seeing human beings as means rather than ends, we are in huge trouble. And so, I get very disturbed about things like, sort of cloning, certain bits of genetic engineering, abortion, all of those things, because they tend to turn human beings into things rather than people. And that's, I think, where we can go dangerously wrong. And that's why I say I love that quote from Gus Steth that I shared, that the problem of the human heart is that greed, selfishness, and apathy. And that needs a spiritual transformation if we're going to avoid some of the mistakes of the past.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And maybe the last question is related to one of the questions that was here. And the question was, Jesus came 2,000 years ago. How is it relevant today? And the question is, how is it relevant? Or how is that relevant to you? How does that actually affect your life, your life today, 2022? Yeah,
great question, Nico, and thank you for whoever asked that too. I think at the end of the day, one of my favourite philosophers and thinkers. I mean, the history is littered with so many brilliant men and women. One of my favourites is a gentleman called C.S. Lewis, who some of you, particularly more of the Christians, may have heard of, who was a Oxford professor. And Lewis once said something interesting. He was an atheist for 30 years of his life and became a Christian. He said, if Christianity is true, it's of infinite importance. If it's false, it's of no importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. And I think if the claims of Jesus stand up, they change everything. Because at the end of the day, we can have academic discussions about God. We can debate, well, is there something out there, some kind of higher power, something that wound up the clockwork of the universe and disappeared off? There's certainly that kind of God. But that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is a God who created each one of us individually, a God from whom we are estranged by our choices and our rebellion, but a God who, despite the fact we would rather be God in his place much of the time, actually chose to step into history in the person of Jesus, offered to take all of our wrongness and brokenness and screw-ups onto himself, take it to the cross and deal with it, that we might have the offer of forgiveness and a relationship with him and an eternity with the God who created all of this universe and its wonder. I mean, that story, if that's true, that changes everything. It has something to say about human value and dignity. It has something to say about purpose in life. It means when I get up in the morning, I am not just a random collection of atoms, but actually there is far more going on than that. And it affects how I treat those around me, because they are far more than those things. So that changes absolutely everything. And what excites me, Nico, about Jesus is, rather than debate these ideas in the abstract, we can take a look at Jesus. We can take a look at his life, his death, his teaching. We can read the Gospels. We can see whether his claims stand up. And if they do, then in Jesus we have a God with a human face, because that's the claim of Jesus, to be that God stepping into space and time and history. And it's been my absolute joy and delight to follow him for the last kind of 40 years or so that I've been a Jesus follower. And what I found, it's been transformative, both in the way I live my everyday life, the way that I've dealt with some of the struggles that life has sent my way, and the way I've thought about these big questions of life. Because the great thing is, as a Christian, you don't have to avoid life's big questions. As a Christian, I can have science, and I can have philosophy, and I can have history, and I can have faith, and all of those things fit together. And it's been an amazing journey. So for those of you this evening who are already on that journey as well, I hope you would second that. And for those who are thinking about these things, and you're here because you want to think about the big questions of life, it's absolutely brilliant. And it's important there are spaces like this to do that. Encourage you to come to the next of these events. And I know, Nico, you were saying before we started the call that I think coming up after Easter, we've got things happening in the church where people can go further on this journey. So if tonight has whetted your appetite, then don't just then sort of, sign off and forget about it. Take that journey of discovery a bit further.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to poll now to see who wins your book. So which was the best question tonight? So I'm going to launch the poll. You can vote there. Basically, the three questions is: question 1, did God create the Big Bang? It was a bit more complex by Gabe, but basically that was a question. 2 is science objective and faith subjective. And 3, are morality and religion, it was phrased in a different way, part of our evolutionary process. So if you like to vote, we'll see who wins that book, and then I'll send it to you directly. But just to say, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. If you've got questions, I always say this, but I work for the church, and Richard, who's our rector, is here as well. And for us, the best kind of day of our week is when we can meet with someone with questions and just bounce them off, share our experience, listen to yours, listen to your questions, and just try and answer it all together. So for us, it's a delight to do that. So if you'd like to do that, just please send us an email. You can find our contact on the website. Hello, sorry. Obviously, my internet Zoom fell just when I was speaking, but the winner was question number 3, the one about the evolutionary process. So Jordan, you've got a book on your way. You've got 50% of the votes, and I'll send it to you. But just to say, it's been great to listen to you, Andy, and thanks for sharing. And as I was saying, we love answering questions. We love to meet face to face and answer any questions you might have. So if you'd like to get in touch on our website, you can find our contact details, and either Richard or I or someone else in the team would love to have a cup of coffee and answer any questions. So as we leave, shall we just give a round of applause to Andy and thank him for coming today.
Very kind. It's been great being with you. Thanks, Nico, and thanks to everyone for taking time out of your busy evenings to be part of this.
Thank you. And the great news is that in a few months' time, Andy's moving to England. So we're trying to negotiate him coming at some point to a church. You can see him face to face and ask even more questions. And he can't escape, then you'll have to answer all your questions. So
look forward to
thanks everyone for coming. Have a lovely evening. And it's been great to be with you tonight. Bye-bye.